Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer Mousillion lore video. Now, to kick us off with the lore of Mousillion, beginning with the history, Mousillion was started along with the other, what would become dukedoms of Bretonnia, by the horseman clan known as the Bretonii. The Bretonii went across the Grey Mountains and colonized the land that would become Bretonnia, which at the time did have a number of old elven ruins, as it was the hub of the elven colonies in the old world. Now, the Bretonii had not fought with Sigmar and thus had never become part of the Empire, but they did start to form into their own Bretonii clans, and those clans would go on to rule territories that would later become the dukedoms of Bretonnia. The dukedom of Mousillion was one of the founding dukedoms of Bretonnia, and it was run at the time, before Bretonnia existed as a nation, by a chap called Landuin. Now, Landuin, or the Mousillion, was firm friends with Thierolf de Lyonnaise and Gilles de Bastogne. Now, the three of these chaps were all good friends, all ran their own individual little sort of kingdoms, or fiefdoms if you will, but Bretonnia as a land, the entire region, had started to become overrun by a number of dark and sinister forces, including beastmen, the undead, the Norscan tribes, forces of chaos, and this was really the darkest time in Bretonnia's history. Thierolf, Landuin, and G got together and were like, look, if we're going to survive this onslaught of antagonistic newcomers to our lands, then we have to band together. And they formed the first alliance of what would become the Bretonnian dukedoms. Now, together they encountered the Lady and became the first 3 Grail Knights to ever exist. They rolled out and, along with Gilles Le Breton, carried out the campaign that would go on to found the Kingdom of Bretonnia. Now, during their campaign to liberate the lands that would become Bretonnia, Landuin and Guy and the rest of the forces of Bretonnia rode sort of south from Bastogne, through Bordeaux, through Aquitaine, through Brionne, across to the Dukedom of Quesnel, and then sort of circled back up to Paravon, and then headed back over to Mousillon. Now, upon returning to the lands of his ancestors, Landuin was devastated, dumbstruck. His lands, which had once been claimed as the most beautiful in the sort of territories of the Bretonnian tribes, had been completely devastated. Where there were once virgin, beautiful spring meadows, there were now swamplands and dead grass and corpses scattered across the land. The landscape had been charred and scorched and had just been annihilated. To say it was a shadow of its former self doesn't even do what had become of Mousillion justice. It had just been completely devastated. So much so that once they rode into the lands of Mousillion, almost the entirety of the Bretonnian army fell silent at the disaster that had befallen the landscape around them. They eventually rode into Mousillion and fought off a horde of the undead while defending the city of Mousillion. Landuin himself, probably enraged at what the undead forces had done to his homeland, rode out and met the head necromancer, decapitating him and sort of bringing the end of the undead horde. Once the dukedoms of Bretonnia had been established, Landuin retired to the lands of Mousillion. He started to run fairly successful kingdoms. The lands recovered somewhat, but really were never going to go back to their former glories as one of the most beautiful sites in the entire Bretonnian kingdom. Having said that, the lands did prosper under Landuin as its duke, but after a few years, a couple of disasters, or at least personal tragedies, struck Landuin, and it said as his mood darkened, so did the whole landscape of Mousillion. The first of these was the death of his dear friend Guy Le Breton, and Guy, being the king of Bretonnia now, having led the forces to the liberation and founding of Bretonnia, had been struck by some kind of greenskin missile weapon while out on patrol. Mourning the loss of his friend, Landuin started to become a recluse, having gone from one of the most legendary knights in the entire kingdom to someone who was hardly seen within his own dukedom. He started to withdraw, and as he withdrew, the lands of Mousillion started to sort of lose some of their brightness, lose some of their allure, as it were. Following that, about 10 years after the death of his friend Guy, Landuin had a falling out with his other dear friend, Thierolf of Lyonnaise. No one's quite sure what kicked off their dispute, but it resulted in a challenge in which Landuin, still being one of the finest knights and probably at the time the best living knight in terms of combat in Bretonnia, defeated his friend and slashed him across the face. Neither of them were killed in the conflict, and later it was rumored that the conflict had arisen regarding the wife of Cherulf, Rosalind of Bastogne, and perhaps an affair or at least a liaison of the heart between her and Landuin. Landuin, having lost one of his best friends to a greenskin attack and another through perhaps his own love affair with the chap's wife, just grew completely recluse until his eventual death in the year of the imperial calendar 1045, about 1,500 years before the current Warhammer timeline. Following his death, Mousillion had faded a little bit. It wasn't quite the gleaming jewel it had once been before Landuin's time, but life went on in Mousillon. It was still very much a significant dukedom within the Kingdom of Bretonnia, until eventually a new duke arrived on the scene. One assumes some kind of an ancestor of Landuin or a relative or however he came to be, and this chap was called Merovech. Now Merovech was a good intended Duke of Mousillion. He wanted to have Mousillion come back and regain some of its former glory it had enjoyed under Landuin, and this was his main aim. However, the advisors he'd chosen under him at the time really were conniving, and no one's sure quite of their motivations, but they led him down some dark paths. And Mousillion became a bit more withdrawn, and no one really knew what was going on within the dukedom of Mousillion. Eventually, around the year 1813 of the imperial calendar, blight of the red pox struck Mousillion, and this was essentially like the plague. People broke out in red pox all over their body, and soon thereafter were dead. And following this, much like in the Empire, following the Black Plague, Skaven rose out from the sewers and from the marshes and from the underground and started attacking the dukedom of Mousillion, and in fact the entirety of sort of southern Bretonnia. Now Merovech, who sort of fancied himself a bit of a hero of old, a bit of the hero of the times of legend of Guy le Breton, or Gilles le Breton, however you like to say it, rode out to meet this new Skaven threat. Unusually, it seemed like none of the knights within his retinue had been affected by the red pox, unlike the armies of many of the other Bretonnian kingdoms around him. He rode out with his retinue to liberate the towns that were under siege in Bretonnia. He marched south initially to Brionne, where he liberated Brionne from a Skaven siege, smashing down with his cavalry upon the Skaven lords there. He then, like Gilles le Breton before him, started marching east to Quesnel, and in his mind, he's recreating this famed campaign of Gilles le Breton. This started to sort of transform into a form of madness, where he actually started to believe he was Landuin reborn, going through this campaign again, and he'd lead Mousillion back to its former glory. But he did actually successfully manage to rally his retinue of knights. He met up on the edge of Athel Loren with some of the Fey people, as we know them, the Wood Elves, and the armies of Paravon. They managed to fight off the Skaven and liberate the southern part of Bretonnia from the Skaven blight. During the final battle of this encounter, where he was joined by the armies of Paravon, the Duke of Paravon and the other knights who were not part of the Mousillion contingent had taken disgust in the way they behaved in the battle. They seemed to relish torturing and murdering their enemy and taking some kind of ecstasy and just the bloodletting that had been occurring during the battle, to the point where it actually disgusted some of the other knights. Now, Bretonnian knights aren't known for their soft-heartedness, so to actually repel them with your behavior, they must have been doing some extremely savage things to these poor rat men, and one rarely feels sorry for the Skaven. But apparently this was one situation where you can torture a rat, and people to such an extent that people feel real bad about it. So after this, despite the fact that people were kind of disgusted, Merovech had in fact liberated much of Bretonnia and really kind of saved the day. So he was like, hey guys, back to my place, let's have a party. And he organized a huge feast for the lords of Bretonnia, not only those who had participated in battle, but the king and the dukes of the northern regions as well. And upon arriving in Mousillon, the knights and the dukes and the nobility that had been invited to this feast were absolutely disgusted with what they were met with. The town itself sort of hung criminals openly in the streets and let them rot. The feast hall in which they were meant to be enjoying their feast with Merovech was just covered in criminals' corpses. There were corpses hanging from the ceiling, corpses on spits next to walls, sort of slowly rotating around or whatever they were doing. And it was just probably the most grisly sight any of them had ever seen. And sort of being slightly on the Asperger's syndrome or not, It takes Merovech a little while, but eventually he picks up on the sort of feel of the room and the read of the room and gets a little bit upset. He's like, why is everyone making grimacing faces? What's wrong with you all? I'm the savior of Bretonnia. You shall be cheering me and we shall be drinking wine and having revelries. But you're all sitting there like bloody grumpy gusses. What's up? The king eventually stands up and says, this is disgusting. Who are you? What is this place? And Merovech, who's said to be a little bit drunk at the time, then challenges the king to a duel. Now, in the midst of this duel, with kind of incredible strength and speed, Merovech sort of strikes out at the king, grabbing his throat, ripping it out, and then managing to, with some kind of inhuman speed, grab a goblet from the table, place it under the king's throat, and have it fill up with the king's blood, and then chins it in front of all of them and sort of like, haha, great drink. At this point, a mass brawl doesn't break out, which I was a little bit surprised about. But what in fact happens is all of the knights go, okay, that's it, we're leaving. We're going to raise up an army, we're going to take you out. Having killed the king, and in his kind of fits of madness that he's now completely in, he's just sort of lost his mind completely, he crowns himself king. Now, no one else agrees with this. The Fey Enchantress says, no, you're not king, don't be a silly prick. And all of the knights of Bretonnia, particularly from Lyonnais, who were the quickest to react, being Moussillon's neighbors, march down to the city of Mousillion and they storm it, and a huge battle ensues. Merovech is said to be standing at the steps of his own ducal palace, and he managed to slay sort of hundreds of knights and peasant soldiers, but eventually he was struck down and killed. After that battle, Mousillion was restricted down to the borders as they exist now. Here we can see on the map on the left the original borders of Mousillion as it stood as a dukedom, but now after that battle and after Merovech and his antics, Lyonnais took over most of the territory, and Mousillion was reduced to the small territory we recognize it as today. So having been reduced in size, Mousillion started to become really just a impoverished province. There wasn't really enough territory to make it worth holding on to, but it was still a dukedom within its own right, and it still existed as such, except as a much reduced in power and influence. And so Mousillion goes on existing like this for another several hundred years or so. Eventually, a new duke rises to power in Mousillion, and his name was Maldred. Now, Maldred is also known as the last Duke of Mousillion, and he was involved in something that became known as the Affair of the False Grail. So around the year 2297, so around 200 years before current Total War Warhammer timeline, Maldred was Duke of Mousillion, and he'd married a woman known as Mallfleur. Now, together, they'd apparently seemed to completely re-establish the city of Mousillion. It had been restored to some of its sort of legendary allure of old. It was looking beautiful and renewed, where there'd been rotting houses and dilapidated buildings and crumbling walls. They all seemed to be completely redone, and people started to talk about the new Mousillion. Now, around the same time, in the sort of general kingdom of Bretonnia, the king of Bretonnia had just recently been slain fighting off a chaos invasion on its northern shores. The king himself had been killed during issuing a challenge to a chaos knight and had been struck down. He unfortunately left no male heirs, but he did have a daughter called Isolde. She was said to be a very beautiful woman, and Isolde at the time was subject to a tradition in Bretonnia, which I'm not sure if is law now, but was law around sort of 6th edition, that if there was no heir, rather than have the sort of Fey Enchantress pick someone, which I think is the law now, Isolde was entitled to pick a quest that knights would have to go on, and whoever managed to fulfill the quest would have the right to her hand and the right to become king of Bretonnia. Now, the quest she picked was the quest to slay a creature known as the Jabberwock. Now, not to be confused with the Jabberslife, beastie animal that the Beastmen could potentially recruit, but the Jabberwock was at the time a kind of mythical creature. No one's sure if it actually exists. So she seemed to set this as a quest for the person who would marry her. Now, whether this was a clever political maneuver just so she could stay in some kind of modicum of power by herself and not have to marry anybody is anyone's guess, but this is the quest she set, and for years and years, questing knights went out trying to find this bloody thing to marry her and become king of Bretonnia, but with no luck. No sighting of the creature had been seen in all the years, so no one really knew what to do. Now, Maldred, at this point, was like, this is silly. Bretonnia needs a king. I'm going to be the one to save Bretonnia, become king, and rule it that way. So he conspires with his missus, Malfleur, who's a powerful sorceress in her own right, and in fact, it transpires that the renewing of Mousillion is not in fact them participating in a new reconstruction effort. It's just her magic. It's just an illusion. Mousillion's still the sort of the rotting hub it's always been, or it has been for many centuries now, but she's just put a sort of new shine on it, made it look brand new, although it is not. So together they go and they start to raid the ancient tombs of the dead near the city of Mousillion. And they find an old chalice and they're like, this will probably do. So she sort of magics it up and makes it sparkle a little bit. And they go about, and Maldred then goes to his court and says, I'm going to embark on my Grail quest. And he sets off out the gates and disappears off. And then, quicker than almost any other knight in history of Grail questing, comes back and goes, I've been on my Grail quest. I found the Lady of the Lake. She gave me this. The Holy Grail. This is a sign that I should be king of Bretonnia. And this is the story he starts to spread across the entirety of Bretonnia, saying, look guys, I've got the Grail. This is mine. Let's do this thing. Let's make me king. I have the blessing of the lady. And of course, this is the chalice that they just dug up from some old tomb. Maldred, not being an idiot, knows there's two kinds of people in the whole of Bretonnia who can factually dispute his story and put any kind of decent argument forward. And those are the Fey Enchantress herself and the Grail Knights, because all the Grail Knights have actually seen the Grail and a sip out of it, and that's how they became Grail Knights. All the Grail Knights currently are really, or most of them, the vast majority of Grail Knights at the moment in Bretonnia, are off to the east, fighting off Orcish invasion. So seeing his chance, and there are conflicting reports on exactly how he did this. One report has him saying that he sent Malfleur with a bunch of Malfleur, his wife, with a bunch of thugs he'd recruited from the docks who were, cutthroats and murderers, not knights of any repute, because knights of any repute would never touch the Fey Enchantress. So he gets these thugs and sends his wife off to capture the Fey Enchantress, and she, with her magic, protects from the Fey Enchantress turning them all into frogs, which she's wont to do from time to time. So she protects them, they manage to bash her on the head, knock her out, and bring her back. Another story has it that Maldred and Malfleur invite the Fey Enchantress around for a drink and dinner, and then sort of poison her dinner so she gets knocked out and they capture her that way. Either way, they capture the Fey Enchantress, and they lock her in a tower known as Donjon of Dole. Now, the Donjon of Dole is essentially an old elven tower that had been built, but had been sort of by the sea for so long, erosion has said to made it look like a malformed finger at this point. And that's where they're keeping her under guard. So with the Fey Enchantress out the way, Maldred holds a tournament. And so everyone in the kingdom can come to Mousillion, see its new sparkling buildings and beautiful walls, which of course are all an illusion. And he has this tournament and he shows everyone, hey guys, look at the Grail, here it is, doesn't it look splendid? So anyone who's not a Grail Knight at this point is like, oh, it looks like it fits the bill, it glows and stuff, that's gotta be the Grail. I believe you, Maldred. Whereas the Grail Knights are incensed and they know it's not the Grail. Now this is where the story has a bit of a hole in it, I will admit. The idea is that they cannot challenge Maldred to one-on-one without him either first being publicly denounced by the Fey Enchantress or be dishonored. They won't just kill another Bretonian. That, at the time of this writing of this story, was the law that they had. They couldn't just challenge him without cause. And so there was no real evidence other than the fact they'd seen the Grail, but there's no evidence outside of Grail Knights possibly plotting a conspiracy against Maldred out of jealousy. That's what he could say they were doing, to allow them to challenge him in any legal way. That's my understanding of it, at least. But for me, it's a bit of a plot hole in the story. There's no real reason why the Grail Knights can't just take him out, but they don't. By their own rules of honor, they don't. So Maldred gets along, and he's starting to get a lot of popular support to be king. They're like, oh, he's got the Grail. Look, he's got to be king. The lady wouldn't just give the cup to anybody. She's not. She's a bit precious about it that way. While others argued, strange women lying in ponds distributing cups is no basis for a system of government, and that supreme executive power derives from a mandate from the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony. So he's starting to win a lot of popular support. Now at this time, just by happenstance, a young questing knight called Gaston de Gistou is marching down the beaches of Bretonnia on the west coast. Now actually what Gaston is doing is he's for years been going around looking for this bloody Jabberwock so he can marry the queen. He's one of these knights who are sort of hoping to marry and become king. And he doesn't see it, but what he does spot on his travels in this kind of very isolated part of the coast of Bretonnia is he spots the Fey Enchantress poking her head out a window. Now, God, he might have special eyesight or something, but God knows how he spots her. So he marches up to this Donjon of Dole, and as he's marching across this very sort of narrow bridge with no railings or anything on it, and obviously with the sea breeze coming up, it sort of moistened this stone bridge, the portcullis of this tower comes down, and out of it sort of spews this ginormous chaos spawn. Sort of taken aback slightly, Gaston lowers his spear and charges, missing. His horse is sliding on the stone paving with the wet stone paving, and he's really struggling to get any kind of footing to get a good charge off against his spawn and take it out. And the Fey Enchantress from above the tower sees that he's struggling a lot, and he's just trying to get an angle. He's trying to keep it at bay, he's sort of fighting it, parrying it, but really not doing much damage and just narrowly avoiding being killed himself. So he kind of retreats a little bit to the other side of the bridge, but the spawn's chasing after him. And seeing his struggle, the Fey Enchantress takes a tress of her hair, ties it in a loop, and throws it from the window. Now again, with his buddy Eagle Eye vision, he can see a tress of hair being thrown from a tower. But not only can he do this, but he sees it, and it's sort of falling down in between him and the spawn. And this tress of hair sort of, imagine, slightly floating as it goes, tied in a loop. And he's like, okay, this is my chance. What a boon from the lady, from the Fey Enchantress. She's giving me her like best wishes and her favor with this hair loop. And he charges at the spawn, and he puts his lance out. So the lance goes through the tress of hair, and it wraps around his lance. He's meant to be inspired by this, and the hint is that the hair itself gives his spear some kind of magical endowment. And so the spear, this time it feels like the spear's almost guiding itself towards the heart of the spawn. Sure enough, when he reaches the spawn this time, he doesn't miss, he doesn't slip and slide. The spear goes straight through the chaos spawn, killing it. In his excitement, and very much a sort of 1960s chivalric film, he charges up the spiral staircase of the tower, still astride his horse, bashes down the door and frees the Fey Enchantress, and they ride off together with her on the back of the horse. What a hero Gaston is. So with the Fey Enchantress free, they immediately ride to where the Grail Knights have started to gather, and they're sort of having a bit of a meeting of the Grail Knights outside of Mousillion, trying to decide what to do about Maldred and his silly claims that he's holding the Grail, despite all of them knowing it's not the Grail. And then the Fey Enchantress arrives, and she's like, okay guys, we can do this. I declare Maldred a malefactor, I strip him of all his honors and titles, let's go get him. So the Grail Knights and the Fey Enchantress and Gaston all ride off towards Mousillion, and they siege it. Maldred at this point, with Malfleur, kind of just shuts the gates. Now, although the walls aren't necessarily the best walls in the world, they're enough to keep the army at bay, and this siege is said to go on for 3 years. Because it's on the coast, it has access to ports, you can kind of smuggle stuff in. They're kind of smuggling food in, and that's why the siege goes on for so long. They don't manage to break down and take over Mousillion. And I'm sure Malfleur's magic had something to do with it as well. Now, at some point towards the end of the 3rd year, they're sort of listening out and, watching it, and a lighthouse in Mousillion, which is known as the Lance of Light, suddenly goes out. And this is a lighthouse that's known to be powered by magic, and it's sort of tied to Malfleur and the king. And everyone around the siege starts to notice that there aren't any lights on in Mousillion at all. There's no noise coming from the city. There's nothing going on. So eventually the Fey Enchantress and a couple of Grail Knights, and she protects them with the magic just in case anything's going on, I assume scale the wall rather than break down the door, because then otherwise why wouldn't they have just broken down the door to begin with? So I'm assuming they scaled the wall and entered the city of Mousillion. There's no guards. There's no one left alive anywhere. What happened was another bout of the Red Pox had struck the entire city, and Maldred and Malfleur and all the nobility of Mousillion, trying to avoid the pox, had shut themselves into the Duke's palace. And here it's said there to have partied and reveled while everyone outside was dying of the Red Pox, sort of not giving a damn. But eventually, almost inevitably, the Red Pox found its way into the palace, and everyone was dead. So the Fey Enchantress, the Grail Knights go up to the palace. They find the corpses of Maldred and of Malfleur. In Maldred's hand, he's still grasping the false Grail. And in the false Grail is said to be this mysterious liquid. And the liquid makes the Fey Enchantress have the reaction. She doesn't drink it, but even upon seeing the liquid, she's said to faint. Now, we're never really told what the liquid is. I have no idea. It's maybe slightly hinted. I'm guessing, this is purely my guess here, not to do with anything else. I'm not sure what the liquid was, but it might have had something to do with them trying to recreate the elixir of life that Neferata had done to create the vampires or something like that. I don't know what the liquid was. That's my best guess. And the Fey Enchantress faints and they get rid of the liquid. After that, everyone returns. Gaston is taken to Princess Isolde, or whatever she's called at the time, and they get married because he freed the Fey Enchantress and saved Bretonnia from the false Grail. And so he becomes king, and he decides never to name Duke of Mousillion again. So Mousillion is no longer a dukedom. He declares it a wasteland. For now, it's a wasteland. No one should really live there. It's not considered part of Bretonnia. It's just a horrible place. It's not part of our kingdom. Let's try and forget it and erase it from our minds. And that kind of brings Mousillion up to current day. A little bit in the future of this timeline, there emerges another chap of Mousillion. I'm going to mention him briefly. He is called Mallobaude. Now, Mallobaude is just said to be a very heroic and fantastic knight. He is not from Mousillion originally. We're not exactly sure where he's from. In fact, his sort of origin is uncertain. It has been rumored he's in fact the bastard son of Louis Leoncoeur. Now, he is a knight of some repute. He's known to be a fantastic warrior and combatant, and he's on his Grail quest. So he's on the quest to become a Grail knight. He's marching around Bretonnia, and he's been at this for years. And he's kind of at the end of his rope, and he goes into a Grail chapel and he starts to pray, and he speaks to one of the damsels inside, and he says, "What is going on? I've been at this for years. This is just ridiculous. Why has the Lady of the Lake forsaken me so? Why won't she give me her gifts?" And the damsel says, "Well, part of the test of Grail questing is to have you commit yourself to doing good deeds, even knowing that the day may never happen when you get upon the Grail." Now, he doesn't react in a villainous way and give up and then turn against Bretonnia. He actually takes heart from this and like, okay, I get it. It's a sort of test of commitment. I'll march out and I'll keep questing and I'll keep doing good deeds and be the best knight I can be. And he goes out and he goes to Mousillion. He's like, there's lots of bad shit in Mousillion. I'll go kill some of that and get myself recognized by the lady. And sure enough, after going through a number of heroic deeds and saving villagers and what have you in Mousillion, he eventually gets the privilege of meeting the Lady of the Lake, and she offers him the Grail and to take a sip from it, and he does. When you're given the Grail blessing, there's usually kind of two things that happen. Sometimes in the lore, the Green Knight appears, you fight him, you best him, and then the lady turns up and she gives you the Grail blessing. In this case, it doesn't seem like the Green Knight appeared, but the lady did turn up and give him the blessing. Now, even once you've got the cup in your hand, it's not a guarantee you're going to become a Grail Knight. It said that you can drink from it, and if you have any impurities in your heart, the drink from the Grail will kill you or make you a Grail Knight. Up until this point, those are the only two possibilities of things that happen to you once you take a sip from the Grail. Now, with Mallobaude, the thing that happens is neither of these things. In fact, what's said to happen is when he drinks, he doesn't become a Grail Knight and he doesn't die. Instead, what happens is he sees through the veils of magic around the Lady of the Lake, around everything that's going on, and he understands what she is. And this realization is that she is Lilith, the elven goddess of dreams. And he realizes that this goddess has essentially been using Bretonnia for centuries, for millennia, to essentially just protect her base at the Silver Spire, I believe it is, at the Silver Spire. So he goes, "You've been using us as a human shield. This is ridiculous. F this. I'm gonna put an end to you, your worship, and free my people, free Bretonnia." Now, the only people who would ever really listen to a chap going against the Lady of the Lake are people maybe hanging around Mousillon. So Mallobaude just goes to Mousillon and he starts to raise an army. Because there's so much devotion to the lady herself, he can only really raise an army of brigands and castaways and maybe even some mutants and whoever just happens to be hanging around Mousillon at the time. So he does deals with the nobility of what remains of the dukedom of Mousillon. He raises knights, he raises some people with similar thinking, and he takes the best of them and trains them, and indeed, it's believed maybe within some of their number are some sort of dishonored Grail Knights. And the best of that retinue becomes one of my favorite units, and I'm hoping we maybe see with the Old World edition, is the Black Grail Knights. And he raises them up and they become part of his retinue. And it's also a cool thing because the Black Grail Knights were originally, I think, created... Now, I'm not sure which way around it goes, but I think were created for the Dark Omen game, which was an old game, very much like Total War, but before the time of Total War, and do check it out if you guys ever get a chance. But they became canon in this story with Mallobaude. So he gets them off and he's like, okay, let's go. And they start a war with a civil war within Bretonnia. Now, at the time of the current timeline in Total War Warhammer, I think he's still trying to gather forces to him in Mousillon. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm wrong about this, but I think the civil war doesn't actually conclude until the end times, and as you guys know, I don't like to really go into the end times, but I really just wanted to mention Mallobaude because I like the fact he put together the Black Grail Knights, and I hope they show up in Total War Warhammer at some point. So that's really the state of affairs. I mean, if anyone's in charge of Mousillion. It's maybe Mallobaude, but I'm not sure on the timings concerning the beginning of Total War Warhammer, and they can make the excuse that he's not yet, and that's why the Red Duke's hanging around there. But that's another flimsier part of the lore in terms of the Mousillion faction that we might see in Total War Warhammer that I'll get into when I cover the Red Duke later on in this video. Moving back to Mousillion itself as a region, as you can see, it's a tiny little area, Mousillion, as it's covered. There are a couple of areas of note. One is the Guerac Circle. Now, the Guerac Circle itself is a small circular stone circle, I'm imagining much like Stonehenge, dedicated to the worship or is sacred to the gods Tal and Rhea. Now, Tal is the human god in the Warhammer world who's in charge of, like, the god of nature, and it's kind of like the god of daytime and the god of animals, that kind of thing. That's who Tal is. And Rhea is the goddess of fertility and farming and babies, stuff like that. So this is kind of an area of like natural pureness and fertility. Bear in mind, the rest of the Mousillion landscape is swamps and corrupted regions and rot and decay and all kinds of horribleness, and there's not really much wildlife to speak of. There's sort of slugs and snails and frogs, and there's not really much woodland to speak of. It's all just swamps and reeds and marshes and nothing really that fantastic. But this little corner of Mousillion is separate from that and still seems like a reflection of the Mousillion of old during the time of Landuin, when it was a beautiful place and one of the most beautiful parts of Bretonnia as a whole. And this is a little like pocket of Mousillion that's been preserved. Now, it's being preserved by the priests of Tal and Rhea, and they have their assistants. And they say they get everything they need from the local woodland to sort of fight off any corruption that might come towards their territories. And they get like food and nourishment from the animals that they hunt and eat in the woods. So they're not like vegetarians or anything. But it does require a constant effort from the priests to keep away the corruption of Mousillion as a whole. And there's also another notable thing in the circle of Guerac, and that is the Oak of Prophecy. Now, the Oak of Prophecy grows just outside the circle itself, this sort of Stonehenge-like circle in the woodland, and it drops acorns. Now, it's said if you eat one of these acorns, you do run the risk of being violently sick. It's an effect described as similar to the galloping trot, so you can imagine that's quite unpleasant. But the acorns give you a vision of the future, not necessarily specifics, but kind of like a broad idea of threats or things that might attack you or what might be coming. And it said the priests used these acorns to predict any sort of monsters that might be coming and either prepare to fight them or avoid them completely or manage to guide them away or ask for aid. And this is how they've managed to preserve this little pocket of paradise in Mousillion itself when everything else around it has just gone to hell. Now, moving on from the Guerac Circle, we have the city of Mousillion itself. Now, Mousillion as a city sits at the mouth of the Grismerie River and is surrounded by swamps. So it's kind of just built into swamps, and the city itself seems to be slowly crumbling into the swamp and giving way and just sort of deteriorating and almost verging on looking like a complete ruin in its own right. In the northeastern part of the town, we get the Lost Town. The northern part of that, there's said to be huge gouges in the earth that lead to sort of deep bodies of water into the swamp, and it said that from time to time enormous huge creatures crawl out of this, and those stories don't seem so far-fetched when you often see some of the stuff either wandering around the town of Mousillion itself or just its outskirts. The southern part of Lost Town in the same district is said to be so swampy and marshy that the heavier buildings that used to stand in that part of the town have just sunk into the swamp entirely and just disappeared. Around the southern gates, just sort of continuing on our tour of Mousillion, is really just kind of a shanty town. It's surrounded sort of outside and inside by just a bunch of huts that people have made because the old wooden buildings have been sort of crumbling and deteriorating for so long, as well building off sort of shanty huts, and the only useful building materials they really have around are just the reeds. So it's just these reed built shanty huts around the outside of the southern gate and on the inside of it. In terms of the Grismerie River itself, the southern channel, as you can see here on the map, was actually formed when that part of the city just collapsed into the swamp. It wasn't always there, so you get the skeletal remains of buildings piercing through the surface of the water, and it's not really navigable by any ships because they'll just strike any of the buildings just sitting there underneath the surface. The northern channel is a bit easier, but still not easy. The northern channel has really become sort of blocked with sediment and thick reeds, and you can't sail sort of massive cross-continental trade ships into Moussillon, into the city of Moussillon. You can only really like do shallow ships that can go in and use the docks that way. So although potentially a huge trading hub, it's just been in such disrepair that it's very hard to use as any kind of commercial hub. Another region of the city is the Chapel Quarter. Now the Chapel Quarter houses the Grail Chapel in Moussillon, and it's the only place where you maybe kind of see some buildings that are still kind of, let's say, up to code, shall we? They're still sort of habitable by any decent human standard. And it's also said to house the well, which is the only well of pure drinking water that's safe to drink, that isn't maybe poisoned by warpstone or cause you to develop mutations or cause your children to develop mutations. So a lot of people around the city tend to migrate towards the well, fill it up, and then take their water for the day from this one source of water in the whole city. It's also said to be one of the safest quarters in Mousillon, fewest amount of sort of non-human threats. You're less likely to be killed by a vampire in the Chapel Quarter, or eaten by a zombie, or whatever else may be wandering the dark alleys of Moussillon come an evening. The chapel itself is a bit of a bizarre chapel. It's run by a group who call themselves the priesthood. Now there are no damsels who are running this chapel, which is very untoward for a Grail chapel. They're always usually helmed by damsels. But it's not a fact that the Lady of the Lake was feeling particularly charitable towards men. The suggestion is that the Grail Chapel in Moussillon is actually run by a high priestess called Aurora, and Aurora is essentially running an organized criminal gang out of the Grail Chapel in Moussillon, as the official Grail religion, or Lady of the Lake religion, doesn't really practice in Moussillon. So she's kind of usurped the religion, uses it to send her priests round who charge for blessings, who charge for any kind of religious ceremony, and it's become a bit of a racket. And the chapel itself is very elaborately decorated with sort of gold leaf and a bit over the top. Imagine sort of the inside of Donald Trump's flat, that kind of look. And it's very gauche for a Grail chapel, which are usually quite demure. In terms of Aurora, it's said that Aurora's maybe having second thoughts about her criminal empire, and is maybe looking to actually become a convert to the religion properly. It's said that she's actually hunting for a relic at the moment, and anyone who'd get her a relic around town, so she can really claim some sort of true divinity. But, you know, whether that will ever happen or not is kind of up in the air. But yeah, essentially a criminal gang run out of the church in the Chapel Quarter, but at least there's clean drinking water there. Now the city itself is in a complete state of dilapidation, if you haven't got that notion already. Over half the buildings lie empty, no one really lives in them. The houses are all rotting, the wood's rotting, covered in fungus and moss, as are sort of all the wooden structures are sort of crumbling, the stone structures are all sort of crumbling away as well. The wells in the town are rumored to be poisoned with warpstone, and thus much like the rest of the province, or what remains of the province of Mousillon, the whole place is just covered with people with mutations and deformities. The graveyards in Mousillon are said to be as large as the city itself. Now, because all the land around the entire area is just essentially a swamp, you can't really bury people in it. So what's happened is that the graveyards have had sort of structures built, and all the people are buried above ground in these fortified graveyards. Now, those who can afford it often post guards outside a freshly buried person tomb to guard from necromancers and people experimenting, and the town is rife with people using Moussillon and its sort of lack of law and order and lack of oversight from the Kingdom of Bretonnia to experiment with all kinds of dark magics and dark goings on, and often that requires corpses. So yeah, the poor tend to get their corpses robbed fairly frequently, and indeed there's said to be a brisk trade of corpse trading in the city itself, but those who can afford put out family guards to guard their bodies at least for a little while they rot away and can't be made horrible use of, although technically they could still be reincarnated even in their skeletal form. One of these sort of notorious tinkerers in the dark arts who became rather famous and infamous rather was Jacques de Noireau. Now Jacques was sort of experimenting with the dark arts, he was practicing with necromancy but wasn't very good at it, and in one of his experiments he managed to unleash a huge amount of power, and that raised the dead all over Moussillon, the city. Now this caused a huge ruckus and fracas, and it took a long time to settle them back down, and it wasn't really a fantastic army of the dead, and I think most of it actually crumbled away because he had such poor control over this huge surge of undead he'd just given rise to, that the zombies he'd risen actually managed to kill and consume him, and at that point there was no one to sustain the magic, and so most of them crumbled away. Now in terms of the people of Moussillon, as I said, most of them have some kind of deformity, from anything from a clubbed foot to a shrunken head to a twisted spine, to sort of withered limbs, to actual just being straight up beastman-like mutants, or just mutants that would be otherwise killed or burned in any other province of Bretonnia, or the Empire for that matter, tend to live on and try to live semi-normal lives in Mousillion. And there's no one who really gives two tosses, really, because it's just that lawless. And now there is nobility in Mousillion. The nobles of Mousillion tend to always wear black plate. The majority of them cover their visors and never lift them. Now, it's speculated as to why this is. In some cases, it's because the lords of Mousillion can be just undead. So whether they be whites or mummies or vampires or even just mutants, and to hide their deformities, they continuously wear their armor rather than reveal themselves to any prying eyes or anyone who would mean them harm for being different, I guess. Kind of. And some of them are just straight up servants of what are known as the ruinous powers, so maybe the chaos gods or the horned rat or whatever else, the powers that are looking just to kill everything and run the world. So that's really the kind of people of Mousillion and the nobles, and the nobles are responsible for what little law and order there is. And people often assume when they go through Mousillion and see all the bodies being hung by sort of road signs and things like that these are all criminals, but God knows if they actually are. It could just be some kind of human sacrifice. It's just a lawless monstrosity of a place to live. And it tends to attract people who like that kind of atmosphere, so you're not going to find the nicest of the nice coming out of Mousillion. The economy itself is a bit of a mystery to the outside world. No one's quite sure how it makes any money. And in fact, it's a hugely impoverished province, I suppose you could call it now, but abandoned dukedom. There is some money and some trade that goes on. Most notably, people hypothesize that there's a large smuggling trade. If people are looking to get things into Bretonnia, they don't have to go through the dock checks of any of the Bretonian or Empire ports. They can bring stuff into Mousillion fairly unwatched and unmolested. So it's become a bit of a smuggling port. And there are a number of sort of dens of iniquity and places you can do, I suppose, what would amount to Warhammer drugs, and really just a seedy underbelly of the entire of Bretonnia lives in Mousillion, including sort of dark art trading shops, books on necromantic lore, stuff like that. Really, it's just a hell of a place. In terms of their food, there's kind of some subsistence farming, but with it all being swampy, really what you get is the people of Mousillion just tend to become scavengers for the most part, eating sort of slugs and snails and frogs and whatever else they can find in the reeds to just keep them alive a little bit longer before something probably inevitably eats them or drinks their blood or turns them into zombies. So really just a hard life in Mousillion, and poor wretched people who are forced to live there. As a result, anyone who's kind of looks healthy enough or like is normal-ish looking can get away with it, tends to escape Mousillion fairly quickly, and they will often go and travel and become adventurers of some sort, or at least travelers, and get to some decent part of the world. And they'll almost inevitably all lie about their origins, and few who ever leave Mousillion and can live a normal life ever confess to coming from there in the first place. One of the kind of rare exceptions to this kind of derelict outlook on Mousillion, at least appears to be an exception on the surface, is Castle Rachard. And Castle Rachard is a place where, most of the peasants around there seem to be normal. They're not horrible mutants, and they're not sort of serving horrible powers, and they're not zombies. There's not a lot of undead around there or what have you. And people are like, okay, this is because it's close to the border with Lyonnaise. And they're like, oh, that's why. But really what's happening is it's a concerted effort from the Lord of Rachard to, firstly, any mutants that are born, he tends to take them to his castle and they're never seen again. And for people who are like born as regular humans within Mousillion, he actually sends out his riding parties to go and find them. And he tells them, look, come live in my province. You look normal. We have a normal looking province. Come live with us. So it's very much a experiment in social engineering, if you will, what the Lord is doing at Castle Rachard. Now, the secret underbelly of this entire thing is you might think he's just trying to run a normal bit of his territory within a horrible and cursed province. But really what's happening is underneath the castle there's a labyrinth of tunnels, and what he's been doing, he's been taking all these mutants, collecting all these corpses from the dead, and he takes care of sort of burial rites within his little territory, and he collects all the bodies and he puts them in these caves. And what in fact he's doing is he's raising a secret massive army of the undead. Now what he's looking to do apparently is to goad Lyonnaise into a fight, get Lyonnaise to march into his lands, and then just have his army pop up from the holes all over this secret labyrinth network of caves and just completely envelop the Lyonnaise army. He'll take it and then maybe crown himself Duke of Lyonnaise and take it from there and spread the curse of the undead of Moussillon all over Bretonnia. So that's this little sly git's plan, but he hasn't enacted it yet. At the moment he's just sitting there in his castle with his little labyrinth of tunnels, just plotting away. Now moving on to a character I said I'd mention earlier, the Red Duke. Now the Red Duke in lore actually has not much to do with Moussillon. Yes, Moussillon is a cursed and dark province, but the Red Duke didn't really spend much time there, at least not in his kind of origin story, as it were. The Red Duke was originally the Duke of Aquitaine, which is another dukedom within Bretonnia. And he, along with his king, went down and they joined the Crusades, which is when Jafar, the Sultan of Araby, marched up through the lands of Estalia and had started to threaten the kingdom, the southern edge of Bretonnia. Now, all the knights of Bretonnia got together, marched south, helped out the last remnants of the Estalian army. They fought back Jafar out of Estalia and then crossed the sea into Araby to fight him there. And indeed, they did defeat the Sultan of Jafar. And during all this fighting, the Duke of Aquitaine had earned himself a name. He proved himself such a sort of noble and able combatant that he started to be called El Sith, which in Araby meant the Northern Sword. He would become feared amongst his sort of Araby enemies to such a point that they'd named him by sight. And yeah, indeed, El Sith was sort of rampaging around Araby, helping out the king and winning the battles for Bretonnia. Now at some point, Abarash, who is the head, one of the first vampires ever to exist in the Warhammer world, and one of the most notable warriors to ever exist in Warhammer period. He was in Araby at the time and he'd overheard the tales of El Sith and wanted to meet him, always looking for a challenge or a fight and just to see good martial skills. He just likes a good duelist. He enjoys seeing a good fight. So Abarash, who, if you want to find out more, do check out my Missing Legendary Lords lore video for the vampire counts just popping up on the right hand corner of your screen now. He eventually tracks down El Sith and he manages to just catch up with him at a coincidental time when he's being surrounded by these assassins. Now he manages to fight them off, but in the sort of fight he got injured and he got poisoned and he was dying. So Abarash sort of rides up to him, having not helped in the assassin sort of attack at all, just kind of watched, comes up to him and sort of offers him the red kiss, which is to turn him into a vampire himself. And he does this. I'm not sure if he asks permission or if he gets permission, but Abarash, just knowing his character, I imagine would ask permission because he himself was tricked into becoming a vampire, and I don't really see him voluntarily doing that to other people. That would be a bit of a dick move, but I'm not exactly sure of the details of that. Suffice to say, he gives him the red kiss, turns him into a vampire, and essentially you don't turn into a vampire straight away, it's not instantaneous. So he returns the Duke to his camp and to his men. And the men just think he's sick and he's kind of in like a semi-conscious state and he's writhing and sweating and they just think he's ill. And on the third day, they assume he's dying or he's dead, and they're just sort of making preparations for him to pass on. Now, the chap who sent the assassins to try and kill him, not necessarily named, he's just a baron of some sort who's in the Bretonnian army. So this is internal strife, you see. It's not the armies of Araby trying to kill the Northern Sword. It's Bretonnians just trying to play power games while they're on the Crusades. So he hears the Duke's sick and just says, like, look, let's just make sure he dies here. Let's not leave it up to chance of an illness. So he sneaks into the Duke's room and is about to kill him, but at that point the Duke awakens, having actually died a little bit earlier, and kills the Baron, having just turned into a vampire. And the Duke emerges from his tent and just starts to kill all the retinue of knights around him because he's not exactly sure what's going on. He's in a state of heightened confusion. He's become this vampire. He's just lashing out. So he's just killing anything he can see. Eventually he comes to his senses a little bit and comes to the conclusion, and we're not told whether this is right or wrong, but comes to the conclusion that the guy behind the Baron trying to kill him and behind the assassins who eventually robbed him of his life was his brother, and his brother was actually the king of Bretonnia at the time. So the Duke, who I suppose now we can call the Red Duke, marches up to Bretonnia to try and kill his brother, and he runs a campaign of fighting, but he draws a lot of soldiers to him. Not every one of them knows he's a vampire really, but he'd made such a legend for himself in the Crusades that a number of people wanted to learn from him and join his fight and learn his ways of waging war, and he managed to gather a significant army to him. Eventually they meet on the battlefield and the armies of Bretonnia managed to defeat the Red Duke. His brother, in fact, sort of striking him down, but because he's a vampire, not quite killing him. Now, his brother, still being a bit of a sentimental prick, decides not to burn the body or dispose of the body to really try and kill him, at least attempt to kill him properly. Instead, what he does, he says, let's put him in a burial tomb and just put some magical enchantments on there so he just stays in there forever. I don't want to completely massacre my own brother. but I'll just leave him by himself forever and sort of torture him that way because I'm a cool bro. But nonsensical, but that's what he decides to do. So after about 5 centuries of him being locked away, the Red Duke is eventually released by a cabal of witches and corrupted nobles. And what they're looking to do is kind of steal his skill to put into a guy that they want to sort of put forward as their own champion for their own plots and nefarious schemes. But they kind of fuck it up. They don't really get it right. They kind of mess the whole thing up, and eventually the Red Duke is just free. They break the bonds. They don't sort of take his skill with a martial skill and put it into somebody else. They just unleash the Red Duke. Having spent the last 500 years alone in a tomb, he's gone absolutely batshit. He is just nuts. He doesn't really understand what's going on. He doesn't really understand it's 500 years. I mean, isolation for one person for over the course of the week can be completely like mentally torturous. But for 500 years, imagine having to go through that. So he's come out and he's just like, oh my god, let's go kill my brother, the king. And they're like, your brother's not the king anymore. What are you doing, man? And he's like, yes, he is. Stop being an asshole. Let's go kill the king. So he starts to recreate the campaign he went through 500 years ago and starts to have battles in like similar places just because he thinks he should. Now, because it's been 500 years, on one of these battlefields, he starts to like encounter or hear about the Duke of Aquitaine. And he's like, and the Duke of Aquitaine at the time is a chap called Guillaume, or Guillaume. Now, Guillaume is, he's like, what's this usurper doing sitting in my seat? I was just gone like a day. What's up with this? Let's go kill him and kill my brother the king and kill everybody. So he rampages off to do this, and they fight a number of battles, a number of skirmishes, and this campaign lasts a little while. But eventually, they get to a sort of deciding battle, and the Red Duke has a huge army behind him. And this time, it's kind of made up of a mixture of just like ne'er-do-wells and maybe some undead in there as well. We're not really 100% sure. But he has a significant army, and he eventually reaches, and in the army he spots that this Guillaume is in the middle of the fight. He's like, all right, I'm going to get you. You've sat in my chair for some reason. You've usurped my seat of government. You've usurped my dukedom, you git. I'm going to smash you with my club, or whatever he's carrying. My sword and my club. Why not both? And he goes off and tries to kill him. And eventually he sort of knocks Guillaume from his sword and runs him through. But in his sort of dying breath, Guillaume explains who he is, and he says, I'm your like great grandson, you silly asshole. Why did you do this to me? Why did you strike me down? And the Red Duke finally has this sort of flash of sanity. So he realizes he's just completely destroyed his legacy, his, well, genetic legacy, the legacy of his bloodline, and distraught and completely shattered, I suppose. He just wanders off into the wilderness. And that's really the last anyone sees of the Red Duke. So I suppose Total War, Creative Assembly are just supposing that after this battle, he just went to Mousillion to start killing other people. I don't know what the lore reason is if you ever get to play as Mousillion. The campaign will be for him rampaging about. As I said earlier on in the video, I'm not 100% sure why they tied him to Mousillion other than the fact that he is an undead vampire and he has the vampire lineage from Aberosh, which is a well-loved, or Aberash, which is a well-loved vampire character in Warhammer. But apart from that, I'm not really sure why they made him the leader of Mousillion. I'd have maybe liked to have seen Mallobaude, the bastard son of Landuin. I think that would have been quite an interesting dichotomy there. But I suppose he wasn't officially a vampire, so it wouldn't have been a good undead faction, really. And that about sums it up, guys, for my Mousillion lore video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was kind of fun to make. And hopefully we will get to play as Mousillion in the old world edition of Total War Warhammer. Many of you might see this after that edition comes out, so we'll probably know by then. But hope you guys enjoyed this one. Please do subscribe if you enjoyed it and would like to see some more lore on Total War Warhammer, or see me play through some Total War Warhammer or other strategy or role-playing games. It'd be great to have you along for the ride. Thanks very much, and do drop a like. It really helps the channel grow. Thanks again, and have a good day.